Hello. Hi there. How's it going? Nice to see ya. Hi. Hello. Hi, everyone. Welcome. Thanks for coming out. Hello. Hey, Cece. Hi. All right. I'll give it a few seconds for people to hop on. While we wait, I would love to know where you're joining us from tonight if you want to let me know in the chat. And if you want to tell me the furthest place you've ever bought vintage or sent vintage to, I'd love to know that too, since we're talking cross-border shipping today. So, hey there, hi, thanks for coming out. Hello, great to see y'all. So yes, let me know where you're joining us from tonight. I'm in Toronto, Ontario, Canada, Montreal. Hey Kathleen, great to see you. Thank you for coming. Welcome to another buyer-seller hotline where we are digging into hot topics that shape the vintage and secondhand sector and bring buyers and sellers together to share ideas, questions, and advice. Denmark, hey Tina, thank you. Kitchener, all kinds of international audience. I love to see it. I am Kristina, Kitchener too, hello. I'm Kristina Urquhart and I'm the publisher of The Vintage Seeker. You may know me by now if you've been watching my stories on tariffs. I'm an independent media platform that I built to spotlight secondhand vendors and help shoppers to find them. So I've been working in media publishing for almost 20 years, creating content for niche communities, and now I use that background to make sure that vintage and secondhand shops get seen and supported. Hello, we have Grimsby, Halifax, and Vancouver. That's it so far. I love that. Some cross-country stuff. I was asking where people are from and what the furthest place that they have bought or sold vintage to is. I know that there's probably some people here who have sold to all over the place. So through the Vintage Seeker, you're going to find our editorial site, free newsletters, event listings, downloads, plus the Shop Secondhand Directory. There's 3,600 businesses, over 3,600 businesses from Canada and the US mostly that are searchable for free there. Vendors and organizers, please list yourselves there too. I can't list everyone, so it helps a lot if you list your businesses and help people find you, especially right now when we are trying to get more people to discover our shops and services, right? I've also recently relaunched our membership program. Consumers can join to get perks and support the Vintage Seeker's work, and vendors can access resources and promotional opportunities for their business and tap into some community support as well. I also do one-on-one consultations, help with content, marketing, customer experience, all kinds of stuff. So you can see all that on my website. Tina has sold to New Zealand, exactly on the opposite side of the globe from Denmark. I love that. That is a far journey for that item to take. Thanks for sharing that. So tonight it is just me on this hotline. Sometimes I have a guest, but hey Michelle, Vintage Vibes. Tonight it's just me because we're going to be talking about what's happening now with the duty-free exemption being gone and tariffs are changing the way that we buy and sell vintage. So what I want to do is kind of go over what has happened so far, especially since Friday, and then cover off some of the big things to know right now. Then I'm going to talk about the impact of all of this. I want to share some stories. I want to hear your stories and get you to share your experiences too. And then we will talk about some buyer-specific stuff and buying vintage right now. And then we will end with more vendor-specific stuff. So selling vintage in this new era, cover some logistical things. So if you have kind of granular questions that you want to ask for. Thank you, Tina, for staying up till 1 a.m. I love that. Please feel free to go to bed anytime. This is going to be recorded and it will be posted on my page and it'll be on YouTube too. But if you do have granular questions about selling, feel free to drop them at any time and we'll note them and then we will kind of get to them towards the end of the call because I know we have a mix of buyers and sellers here and I want to stick to sort of more general and buying stuff at the beginning and then move to the vendor stuff at the end so people can drop off. So I don't want to overwhelm anybody. This is all something that I think people have had to familiarize themselves with lately, and it's something that a lot of people probably wish they didn't know about, these tariffs, right? So it's not exactly exciting stuff, but we are here and we are going to talk about it. So if you are a buyer at any point, please feel free to share your questions, your stories with what you are experiencing so far in the comments. I'd love to hear. This is supposed to be interactive, even though it's just me talking here right now. I'd love to hear from you in the comments. And if you are a seller, please feel free to ask questions of other sellers, share what you've learned so far, some of your challenges, ask questions, and advice, all that kind of stuff. You can drop it in the comments. So this is kind of a chance for people to come together and swap experiences and learn from each other about all this. So just a couple of, I guess, initial notes. I obviously know some stuff. I know a decent amount about tariffs, but I certainly don't know everything. And I am a publisher, right? So I research information, I share information, but I am not a customs broker, I'm not a shipper. And it's always best to get very specific information pertaining to an individual scenario from them directly. They can help you out and they're going to have the most up-to-date information. I know we have international watchers. We have somebody on this call, Tina from Denmark. We have people who are planning to watch later. Internationally, this is going to be a fairly North American discussion. I'm in Toronto, as I mentioned off the top. But a lot of what we will chat about pertains to everybody, right? Because these rules are pertaining to everyone. So I will be talking about USMCA and CUSMA a little bit. But always check with your local express carriers and your mail carriers as well, of course. So we also had somebody, Nostalgic Links Vancouver, located in Vancouver, sold to France, UK, Sweden, etc. So great. Lots of international buying and selling. So we will talk a little bit about where things are standing right now. Quick recap, I think most of us probably know by now that last Friday, August 29th, the de minimis exemption was lifted. So that means that there are tariffs, the US has imposed tariffs on all imports now, unless they are exempt. And exemptions include some items under U.S. code called 50 USC 1702B. So that's informational materials, artworks. Some stuff is exempt from tariffs under that. And then some of this USMCA and CUSMA stuff is exempt as well. And we'll come back to that. Importantly, a lot of vintage and secondhand is not CUSMA compliant. And that's why this is so detrimental to our sector in particular. So Kathleen in Toronto, coming in next week for work. Love to see it. It's always a nice commute from Toronto to Montreal, I think, anyways. It's a short jaunt. Tariffs are applied on country of origin. Okay, so that is the origin of the item, not where the item was shipped from, but where it was actually originally manufactured. So that's where they will determine what percentage rate your item is going to be tariffed at. Okay, so tariffs and customs duties, I just want to go over this again quickly at the beginning just so that we have clarification. Tariffs and customs duties are two different things. So both are taxes on imported goods. They serve different purposes, right? So tariffs are a surcharge that are meant to make foreign goods more expensive and to protect domestic manufacturing. So the 2025 tariffs, the IEEPA tariffs that the US imposed, right? That's an acronym for International Emergency Economic Powers Act, right? So when we talk about IEEPA, that's what we're talking about, the ones that were enacted this year. Those apply to all imports, and their intention is to make domestic manufacturing more attractive, even though they're kind of under the guise of we're trying to stop the influx of illegal substances entering the country. The idea is to make domestic manufacturing more attractive. That's what a tariff is for. Customs duties, they're a standard tax. They're applied at the border. They're based on product codes that are set by the World's Customs Organization. So every item that you buy has a code that's attached to it. And the whole world shares the same codes for the same things. And then every single country has a duty rate that they attach to that code, and those duty rates differ. So duties are paid based on the item value. There's some instances where they're paid based on the item value plus the cost of shipping, but those are less usual cases. But generally, if you have a $50 item and a 5% duty rate, then the duty is that 5% on the 50. So that's how those are calculated. Okay, some goods are duty free. So they're even still duty free after August 29th, and you can find out which ones are duty free by using the chart that the US uses called the Harmonized Tariff Schedule, okay? And it'll tell you in there which ones are duty free based on the code that they apply to. So consumer goods generally fall within the 5 to 7% range for duties, but they can go as high as 40%. So it really can vary when you are selling an item and you're covering those duties, or when you are buying an item and you have to pay those duties, like what that duty might be, right? So it's important to try and calculate that ahead of time so you know what you're getting yourself into, right? So there are two ways that tariffs and duties are applied, right? People on this call might be familiar already, but I'm just going to go over some of it at the beginning just so that we all are on the same page in terms of definitions. But tariffs and duties are applied via delivery duty paid, that's DDP, so we talk about DDP, and delivery duty unpaid, that's DDU. So difference is duty paid means in most cases the vendor is paying ahead of time. So right now when stuff is traveling into the United States via postal shipment, the vendors are having to pay those tariffs and duties ahead of time on behalf of the buyer. There will eventually be probably infrastructure in place on various platforms that will allow the vendor to charge the buyer for those tariffs, to prepay them ahead of time. But right now, if you're picking DDP, that means that the vendor's covering those tariffs ahead of time. And then the other one is delivery duty unpaid. So that's important to know as a buyer, because that means that you are getting a bill when that item comes to your door, usually at your door. Sometimes it'll be an invoice after the fact, but often it's like when UPS or FedEx shows up to your door and they hand you a customs bill with duties and tariffs and a bunch of other fees on it. So getting to know what your item is being shipped via how your item is being shipped is helpful. So I will talk a little bit more about that later. So that's how stuff enters. Postal shipments, so those are the ones that are going to the US. Some countries are still suspended, so they're not sending postal shipments. In the case of Canada, Canada Post is sending postal shipments, right? So those are only getting tariffs right now, not the duties that I just talked about, and then a few small fees. So that's what they're supposed to be getting. What's happening on the platforms at the moment is a little bit of a different story, and we can come back to that, but a mail shipment should only be getting a tariff. So in the case of an item that was made in Canada, right now it would be getting a 35% tariff. In the case of an item that was made in the UK, it would be getting a 10% tariff, because that's the rate for the UK. So that's items that are coming by mail. Items that are coming by mail, postal shipment, also have to be sent DDP. So that means, again, delivery duty paid, duties prepaid by the vendor, okay? So when an item comes via postal shipment, there are two options. It gets that percentage that I just talked about, or it gets a flat rate. So there's two ways that a postal shipment can charge duty, or charge tariff, I should say, right now until February 28th. So if they go the percentage route, then you get that 10%, the 35%, whatever the percent is that corresponds to the country. If your mail carrier is charging a flat rate, and I haven't heard of any that are using the flat rate yet, so the numbers sound scary, but I don't know of any that are using it in practice. If anybody knows, let me know in the comments. The flat rate is $80 if the country's tariffs are less than 16%. The flat rate is $160 if the tariff rate is between 16 and 25%, and it's $200 if the item has coming from a country or was made in a country that has a tariff rate of over 25%. So again, I know this is it's a lot, and there's different rules even within like postal shipments. There's all these rules, so it can be really hard to get a hold of. But for the most part, any mail shipments that are going through are just receiving that 1% share, so it's fairly easy to calculate what that's going to be. All other shipments, so if they're not coming by mail and they're coming via FedEx or UPS or Pure Later or whatever, they're getting the tariffs, and then they're also getting those duties I mentioned. So usually in those cases, it's DDU, so delivery duty unpaid, and the buyer is paying those at the door, okay? So that's what's happening right now for almost every country. There's a special case with China, Hong Kong, and Macau. So until November 10th, those countries on items that are valued at or under US $800, 54% tariff. So it's different specifically for those ones. And there's also a per item flat fee as well, options. So again, just look into where your item is coming from, and that'll kind of help you determine how much how much of a tariff it's getting. I mean, India just got hit with 50% the other day too, so there are some countries that are getting close to the high levels that China's at. Anything over US $800 gets treated all the same way. So tariffs, duties, brokerage fees, merchandise fees, all the fees, if it's over $800, it's always going to get that. There's no leeway or wiggle room like there is for the postal shipments getting the tariff only, okay? So again, before I continue, if you have any questions, please drop them into the chat. I know that was a lot, especially when I'm speaking it out loud. It almost feels like I'm not even making sense, but because there's so many different rules. If you have a question, by all means, drop it at any point and I'll continue on in terms of where things are at right now. So right now, Canada dropped its retaliatory tariffs on Monday for U.S. origin items that are USMCA compliant. And we'll talk about what that means again in a minute, but most vintage is not USMCA compliant. So, it doesn't really matter much for this sector. So the big things to know going forward, I think, are in terms of the DDU carriers, the express carriers, your FedEx, your UPS, it's pretty much business as usual right now in terms of how things go through. There are delays at the border that you can expect, I think, for the next little while as they process a lot of this stuff. But if you are, shopping online and you see a listing and it's coming FedEx ground, you have a pretty good understanding that thing is going to be able to come and get to you. And same thing if you're sending, it's pretty much status quo right now. Not much has changed on those platforms in terms of what is required. The DDP platforms, the platforms that are charging the duty ahead of time, are still a lot of the time figuring things out, I would say. They're available, stuff is moving, stuff is getting to the border. But there have been, I've seen errors in the tariff calculations, in the HS codes, there's some problems. So if you are a seller using one of those platforms and you see something not quite right in what the calculation is giving you, alert the provider to let them know when you experience something, because that can help iron out all these details, because these are, kind of just being created this week in some cases. Some of them existed already. So many sellers are still paused to the US. So even though there are ways to get items to the US, for some sellers, there's not a viable option for them to get there, right? For their business that makes sense for them. So some are able to use those express carriers and that's going to work for them, and some can't because of the inventory value that they have. For instance, it may not make sense to send something that requires a more expensive shipping option for, a $20 item or whatever. Tina, if the reason for tariffs is to keep and move manufacturing to the U.S., then it doesn't make sense to include vintage antiques. Are we just getting caught in it? Yes, you are just getting caught in it. It doesn't make sense to include vintage antiques. I think it's just that this sector is so, in the grand scheme of things, it is so small that it's not even on the radar of anybody who's creating any of this. I mean, even the tariff schedule that we have with the HS codes, right? There's not many that are specific to secondhand goods. In fact, I think there may only be the one for worn clothing, and even then it's supposed to be extremely worn out clothing. So none of this was designed for this space, even though this space has been around for ever. Antique dealers, vintage dealers have been around for ages. It is just so small that it's not considered, and it's unfortunate because it is a huge part of retail going forward, right? Everybody's talking about reusing things and going towards a more circular economy, and so it's unfortunate that this is the way that it is. So there may be changes eventually for it, but unless people make a lot of noise about it, it probably won't happen. But you can certainly ask for advance rulings through Customs and Border Protection as well. So you can give them a scenario and they can rule on something and let you know if there is some sort of way for your item to come through, if you find one of these HS codes and you think it might work, you can kind of appeal to them and have them adjudicate on it so that you can use that going forward, and then you have that kind of documentation that you are safe in their eyes, right? If anybody else has any feelings or thoughts or stories they want to share, feel free in the comments. I will just kind of take them as we go, and I'll kind of keep going. So yeah, sellers are paused, right? So the last thing I guess to kind of know right now is that the U.S. Court of Appeal has ruled the tariffs illegal, right? So these are specifically the reciprocal tariffs that Trump announced in April. So those are the ones that really skyrocketed all the tariff rates. Canada's went to 35%, China's went quite high as well, to 54. It was like over 100 for a while, but it's back to 54. And then it also includes the tariffs that he put on Canada, Mexico, and China before that time too. So the court has given until October 14th, before those tariffs have to be overturned, but the plan for Trump is to bring it to the Supreme Court, so that deadline may change, right? If the Supreme Court agrees with the U.S. Court of Appeal, so that means if the Supreme Court rules that they're illegal as well, then the deals that Trump has made so far will fall through. The tariff policies will have to get undone. So this whole thing might be quite short-lived, right? Legal experts are saying by the end of the year there could be a decision. Trump has said today that he is asking for an expedited ruling because he wants an answer faster than that. So we might know well before then. So that's where that's at right now. But in the meantime, everything is kind of status quo, and the tariffs are on, and people are either sending stuff or they're still paused. So I know that that's a lot in terms of where we're at and how things are moving right now. And it's not very exciting to buy and sell vintage to the US right now. I know that makes it very complicated, right? But we'll talk about ways to do that still in a little bit. And we will talk about local opportunities as well. So I would love to hear if everything I've said is kind of matching what you've seen, if you've bought anything in the last few days, or if you've tried to sell anything. Let me know in the comments. Would love to hear from you. Before I talk a little bit about impact, I want to go over USMCA and CUSMA again in a more general way, I guess, and then we can get into the specifics in the vendor segment about what it actually means to certify. Michelle at Vintage Vibes shipped via Canada Post today. Item was a vintage moon and stars decorative mirror made in Indonesia. Tariff I paid using the Zonos app was 17 and change ship was 20. Yeah, okay, so that is a $37 shipping and tariff charge. And your shipping would have probably been around 20 before, probably, I would assume. Probably hasn't changed too much in terms of the shipping rate. Well, thanks for sharing that. Yeah, made in Indonesia. Okay. And did you use the Zonos app? Okay, great. So that's working. I've heard some good things about the Zonos app, that it seems to be working for some people, and then some people are having trouble with it. So I think they're updating it a lot. So, yes. Okay. So yes, we're looking at like a $17 price difference for the vendor right now, and how that vendor wants to deal with that is really up to them. Some people are just going to eat the cost right now, which is unfortunate because of having small margins in the first place. Others will try to look to pass that cost off to customers, but it's tricky in this space to do that because if they work the price into the price of the item, then they may end up having to pay more duties on it, right? Like if the item is artificially inflated to account for tariffs, then they are actually claiming more for the item value when it comes to being assessed by customs. So it's kind of a tricky balance. And some vendors are also, what you might see is people are doing like a flat handling fee. So that's something I've seen as well, and just being like, it's $20, that's going to cover my tariff costs, and this is an extra charge right now. Something to note from SK Finds Thrift, I inputted the same information for a top to send to a buyer for fun via Stallion and Chit Chats, and both charge different rates. Yes, so that's what I mean about the platforms being really inconsistent right now. I've done some testing myself, and U.S. origin items, the jury's kind of out on whether made in USA items will get a tariff. I've heard different things from different people, including from U.S. Customs, who have basically said they won't guarantee it. But Chit Chats has said that the U.S. origin items will go duty-free, and today I tested a U.S. origin item, and it's charging the tariffs on it, which it shouldn't. There are no tariffs for the U.S., and if it was charging duties, it didn't quite match up with what the duty would have been for that code either. So, like I said, I think the platforms, it's only been a week since those things have been out, so we'll see. Hopefully they're working on them all the time. Thanks for sharing that. Tina, non-US customers will pay as I can't on Etsy differentiate prices. Right, yeah, that's another great point. So there's not an easy way for somebody selling on Etsy who to make like a different price for the US customers. So if you have to jack up the price of your item to cover duties, that means that everybody else has to pay that extra too, right? Okay, so USMCA and CUSMA, I will talk about it generally, like I said. Both the US and the Canadian tariffs actually don't apply if an item is certified USMCA or CUSMA compliant. So I mentioned earlier that vintage antiques and secondhand, unfortunately, don't often fall in this. They can qualify, but it's difficult to prove due to missing tags or missing marks or not having manufacturer information, and needing to actually prove that an item was made somewhere is quite different than just it saying this was made in Canada. You don't have any documentation or information to say, well, it was made in Canada using Canadian wood or whatever the thing is that they're looking for. So USMCA, quite tricky for vintage stuff. The other thing is that postal shipments, so anything going via Canada Post, is not eligible for USMCA CUSMA. So that was clarified very recently, but they are not allowed to claim those. So you can only even try to claim USMCA CUSMA on like a DDP provider that is not the mail carrier. Only goods that are originally manufactured in Canada, US, or Mexico can actually qualify for USMCA. And compliance requires like an informal statement, which seems very easy if you're using one of these providers. It's like a form that you have to fill out, and you have to tell them what criteria it falls under, and then just like give a little description statement. The problem is that you need to be able to prove that at some point if you were audited. So you can try to get something approved. It may not get approved, so the shippers are looking at those submissions, and then they are deciding whether or not to approve them. So you might get something approved and it might go through, and that might be great. So if you get audited, then you can no longer approve it, and that becomes a bit of a problem. So ZYMO3, are we marking items for where they are made or as from Canada on Zonos? Are we marking items wherever they are? So I think that you have to do that for everybody, unless Zonos has a different criteria. If anybody wants to chime in, I'm pretty sure you have to mark. Customs and Border Protection wants items marked with the country of origin. There is a U.S. code, the number is escaping me now, 1904, I think it is, that says that items older than 20 years old don't have to be marked. And I did hear from U.S. Customs that, you know, the outside of the package would just need to be marked in that case, so the individual items wouldn't. A lot of sellers are marking individual items anyways, just in case, because you never know who's gonna be the person that opens up your package. But I would mark items for where they're made as much as possible if you could. And then, yeah, if anybody wants to chime in, if you've used Zonos, country of origin on Zonos. There you go. Thank you. Vintage vibes. So you do have to put that in. Unfortunately, I personally haven't been able to use Zonos because I don't have like integrated orders to put into it. It works a little bit differently than the other platforms, so I haven't been able to actually test it myself. So I appreciate you chiming in with that. Thank you. The other part about CUSMA or USMCA is that the proof actually requires those strict rules of origin. So the rules of origin include an item being entirely produced in one of those three countries, Canada, US, or Mexico. It means what they call a change in tariff classification. So basically it would become a different HS code, a different code, because it had been transformed substantially in one of those countries. There may be requirements on how much of a material if you were transforming it as well. So there's rules within that. There's also an option where the good had to undergo a specified process, they call it. So that might be being able to prove that a shirt was cut and sewn in North America, right? And then another one is a certain amount of value must be added in North America. So you have to be able to tell them that in some way if they were to ask, right? That's the whole point of this. That's why it's quite stringent, and that's why it's built for manufacturers as well, right? Because they can provide all that information. They have like documentation about every part of their production process. So like Tina was saying earlier, this sector's overlooked and all of that. Nobody was thinking about vintage and secondhand when they were writing up the rules for CUSMA. So that's why it's kind of left out of this conversation, unfortunately. Hello, everyone. Welcome. If you've just joined recently, I'm kind of going over some stuff that's happened over the last little bit, going over some definitions. Then we're going to talk about impact, tips for buying and selling. And you can drop in questions, feelings, thoughts, anything at any time. If you want to contribute, I would love to hear from you. I always love to hear how things are going for people. And I'll ask some more specific questions as we move along. So things that you can help to prove a USMCA certificate of authenticity, right? Documentation, production records, that kind of thing. If an item is not USMCA compliant, so most of your vintage and secondhand, there's still going to be your tariffs. And we talked about what those tariffs were at the beginning, right? In the US, if it's made in Canada, that tariff is still 35%. If it's made in Mexico, then that tariff is 25%, right? So even though they might have qualified under CUSMA, you know, if you had the documentation to prove it, since you don't, then they get those tariffs. And then in Canada, non-compliant goods also get that 25% surtax still, even though a lot of them were dropped on Monday. Common question is, are antiques exempt from all of this? So antiques 100 to 250 years old or older may still be duty exempt, right? But we talked about tariffs and duties being different. So now for the most part, antiques are subject to the IEEPA tariffs. So again, some printed artworks and materials, like informational materials, can still be exempt from both tariffs and duties. There is a provision for that in the legislation. I don't want to call it legislation, in the executive order. And antiques can qualify under USMCA as well and potentially avoid the tariff piece, but vendors again have to be able to prove that provenance with a certificate of origin. So regardless of all that, there is that HTS, the HTS US, the Harmonized Tariff Schedule, the chart of all the duty rates that I talked about. So if an antique is showing free in that column, so that means it'll still get no customs duties. And most antiques are still free, most of them. There are going to be some that probably don't fall under one of the codes that is, but most of them, there'll be free customs duties, and then those tariffs will still apply, right? So if you are shipping something via FedEx and it's an antique, I don't know, box or something, and you've got that code that says that it's free, then it would just get the tariff and then not the customs duty on that, right? So again, vendors can request a customs ruling if they want specific clarification. Okay, I want to talk about impact. So I would love to hear from people who are here on this call. If you are a buyer and this has made you kind of reconsider shopping internationally, if you are a seller, what has been happening for you lately in terms of the impact on your business. I would love for you to share in the comments so that people can get an idea of how this is affecting people, right? I think I would be remiss if I didn't acknowledge the fact that this has been a very difficult time for business owners in this space, and I really don't want to shy away from that. I ran a survey of sellers, and mostly sellers, that answered, and respondents had between 65 to 90% of their clients, their customers, coming from the US, right? So that's a small sample. It was a small sample, but indicative of a lot of businesses that were doing cross-border trade with the US. So this is like earth-shaking for a lot of small business owners in terms of how they are going to move forward, how they are going to end up shipping, how they are going to, if they're going to end up continuing to ship, how they are going to replace lost business. So it is a very serious matter. From the trunk, seller this side, I paused 1 week shipping but have not received a sale since. So are you back up on did you reactivate your shipping and then you haven't received a sale, or you just paused and haven't received any sales even to Canada? 95%. Okay, so that's, yes, okay, so I get it. So you haven't received any from Canada then, because you're paused right now to the US. So 95% of your sales are from the US. Yeah, so that's a perfect example, right? A lot of sellers selling on eBay, Etsy, they are reaching the huge US market, right? There's 340 million people in the US. So there's way more people there that can find their items than there are in, say, Canada, which has, 40 million people. So SK finds, all my clients come from the US. I've been selling online for over 8 years and had to turn off my store until I can navigate this, still figuring some things out. Thank you for sharing that. I'm sorry that this has been what it has been for both of you and for everybody on this call. It's tough. I want to share a couple of answers from the survey that I did. Somebody said I have no choice but to pause shipping to the US, which unfortunately means losing nearly all of my revenue. I'm based in a rural area of Quebec, so this change has had a significant impact on my business. Another person said more than 65% of my sales are to US customers. Shipping from and in Canada is expensive, especially compared to USPS. I may just fold. So that's kind of like where people's heads are at. I want to kind of stress that. And for US buyers who may be on the call, yes, that's a good thing to highlight, that Canada, it's a big country, right? And our postal within our country is crazy expensive. So the US has been attractive for people in other countries because it can offer good rates for the shipping as well. Tina, I have paused my shop on Etsy vacation. 70% of my customers are from the US. Denmark Post has suspended shipping to the US. Yes, so you're kind of stuck right now unless you're able to find a carrier that does that DDP option outside of your mail service, and or use an express carrier, and that might not be the right solution for you. Curia Grizz, why did they change it from 2027 to August? Great question. So for anybody who doesn't know, the de minimis exemption removal is part of the big beautiful bill that has been passed and is going to be implemented in 2027. So it's part of that, and it was in essence sped up and put into place in August this year in 2025. And while I'm not in Trump's head, I can assume that it was because of wanting to produce that extra revenue like right now. So that's part of why Trump is doing this too. He feels that this is going to generate a lot of revenue for the United States, and it does on paper, but it also costs a lot to facilitate all of this. And there was a reason why the de minimis exemption was there in the first place, right? So something like lowering the exemption might have been a better option rather than removing it altogether, because there are ramifications to this, as we've already seen, including shipping, mail carriers suspending shipping, which apparently some U.S. lawmakers didn't know was going to happen. So there have been serious ramifications to this, but I think the only answer is like wanting to make a splash and wanting to make as much money as they could as soon as possible, especially potentially if he anticipated this ending up in the Supreme Court at some point. I think using it as a proving ground to be like, okay, well, we took in $8 trillion in revenue or whatever the amount is gonna be in September, to be able to hang your hat on that and say, well, look at all this money that this made the U.S. right now. So that's possibly why. SK finds thrift. My mom and I were hoping they could even change it to a $200 limit. That would open up a lot of hope for some people. Absolutely. It would be huge for this space. There's so much stuff in this space that goes under 200, right? Like it's not, I mean, obviously there's stuff that's more than $200, but there's a lot of stuff that crosses the border that's like $50, $40, $25. So the administration of doing that is beyond comprehension, I think, and so we'll see what happens over the next few weeks, to be honest. Like, it's possible that it'll just be so overwhelming. But they have created this process where they're now asking for tariffs to be prepaid in a lot of cases, which actually takes the burden off of them quite a bit and makes it a lot easier, right? Like, they've already pre-cleared. Anything coming via postal has pre-cleared by the time it comes to the States. So there is less work on their end for those. So yes, I agree. A $200 limit would be fantastic. That would have been nice. Dreaming big. That's allowed. Thanks. Tina, Etsy, eBay, and Amazon must also be affected by vintage reselling declining from less international sales. Absolutely. Absolutely. So eBay is going to be instituting a way to collect duties at checkout in October, which I think is a relief for a lot of sellers. You know, they'll be able to grab those in the same way that anybody who buys in Europe pays that VAT tax ahead of time. It'll be kind of like that. Etsy may do that eventually. Amazon may do that eventually. I don't know about Amazon though, because there's some friendships there that who knows what Amazon will do. But it's possible that Etsy will do that too. And I think that they will. It's not just the vintage and reselling, right? For Etsy, it's the handmade too. There's going to be a big decline in sales from that. And they don't want international vendors to skip out on their platform either, right? So it is something I'm sure that they're considering. But again, it's only been a little bit. So people are still scrambling, even though we knew it was coming, even though Trump said that this was going to happen this year, earlier this year. I think a lot of people, understandably, kind of were like, we'll just see what happens because of how things have happened over the last few months. There's been a lot of stopping and starting and pausing and unpausing. So I think it took everybody a little bit by surprise that it was a 30-day turnaround and that 30-day turnaround happened and that there wasn't an extension or a pause, right? So if you're just joining us, hi, great to see y'all. We all thought he'd fold. Yeah, Taco would fold. If you're just joining us, I'd love to hear your comments and thoughts about how this is impacting you as a business owner or as a consumer, if it's changing your buying decisions, if it's affecting your business, let me know in the comments. We're just sharing a little bit about that right now. If you are on the call right now or watching it later and you have made the decision to not shop internationally because of this, and there's many reasons why people are doing that, whether it's a money thing because of the duties and tariffs or because of a, wanting to align with your domestic, your own country, I should say. I implore you to support your local vendors as much as possible. Your local vendors, whether you are in Canada or the US or Europe, if you have made that decision to not shop internationally, to look at who's around you right now. Many of them were involved in cross-border trade or still are to some extent or trying to figure it out. They are hurting right now. So if you just joined, I just shared a couple of, I guess not case studies, but little quotes about how people are, how they're affected by this. And we've heard some people in the comments as well share. So it's a tough time right now. The tariffs have made fast fashion very unattractive, which I think is nice. It's more expensive for buyers. So, if you're finding yourself in those kinds of decisions, thinking secondhand first, supporting your local people, if you are a collector and you are open to shopping internationally, to do that where you can too, right? So as I said earlier, this sector is the future of retail, right? And at least as far as North America is concerned, it's unfortunately getting hit in a way that most areas of retail are not because of that USMCA CUSMA loophole and the fact that vintage and secondhand doesn't fit in. And on a global scale as well, it's also, getting hit in a way that other sectors aren't, because the margins are very thin for people to be able to prepay duties. And a lot of people were using those mail services to get these items in because, like I said earlier, a lot of the items are $25, $40, $60, $80, and they are using the mail carriers. And now in 25 countries, the mail carriers aren't even delivering anymore. So it is, it's really shaken things up for sure. So I'm going to cover some kind of bird's eye impact stuff, I guess, but I'd still love to hear from you in the comments if you want to share about the impact that this has had for you. Feel free. So what we're going to see or have been seeing is fewer shipping options, right? So many carriers are now requiring prepaid tariffs and duties. And like I just said, international vendors can't necessarily afford to cover those. So raising the prices, their item prices, makes them uncompetitive as well. So it's just fewer options to ship things because people are kind of backed up against the wall, and they may be like, okay, well, FedEx is the only way that I can viably do this for my business, and that means that as a buyer, you know, you are paying that premium for shipping. We're also seeing maybe some shipping complications. We haven't heard too many reports just yet after the 29th, but we will see. Vintage and secondhand items are often lacking manufacturer or origin details, right? So for some carriers, they are requiring manufacturing information, so that might mean that a seller can't ship their items via that platform, or that they need to find a workaround to do that. And that can lead to delays at the border if stuff has been labeled incorrectly, so there's impacts there as well. There's also, you know, higher costs for business owners. So postal affiliated carriers especially are allowing those prepayments, but those duties, brokerage fees, the taxes, that's all happening upfront, and that cuts into their margins. So that's an impact as well. Revenue loss as well. So we talked about this a little bit earlier, but US buyers were a huge market, right? So losing access to that market kind of threatens the survival of some of these resale businesses. We talked about a couple examples of people who are considering, you know, closing their businesses. Hollywood Weddings, hi Lori. Why do they require manufacturer information if we are paying duties and tariffs upfront? Yeah, $1 million question. I don't know. I don't know why they are asking for it. I agree that if the tariff has been paid, then nobody should care about where it was made, because you have declared the country of origin, and you are giving them the money that they are asking for. So I don't actually know what the purpose of that is. It is my understanding that the Canada Post solution is not requiring that. But again, like I said earlier, I haven't been able to see that platform myself due to the way that it's set up. So do look into that option. But I don't know why they're doing it. It's just a requirement that they seem to have. So reduced access for US buyers is another impact, of course. Fewer international shops, you know, Canadian, European are shipping to the US, right? People have paused their shipping. It's limiting choice. It's limiting the selection that's there. It also can result in less competitive pricing domestically. So basically, if less and less people outside of a country sell into that country, the sellers in that country can continue to raise their prices if they have less competition, right? Hollywood Weddings, 100% compliance, so all seems crazy to me, but we'll look into that. Yeah, for sure. Thank you. Tina, I might put Farmer Olaf on a farm in Sweden as the manufacturer of an antique wooden box. You can try it. Like, it is the Wild West out there right now, I keep saying, so you can try things. The only thing I can say is that I know that they are spot checking, and I know that some shippers, like Chit Chats, for example, in Canada, have said if you don't have the manufacturer information to not send it, but that doesn't mean that people aren't trying, and that doesn't mean that people aren't going to do that. So use that information how you will, but I will say that they spot check, and there could be a fine if it's something's off, but some people are willing to take that risk, and that's okay too, right? Like, everybody's got to make their own decision about how they're gonna handle this. So boosting for local shops. So one of the positive things that this all brings, right, is buyers turn to domestic businesses. So for US vintage sellers, this could be a good thing, right? Like, they're people who are trying to avoid cross-border costs are going to turn to their vintage shops in the US, which is, you know, kind of the whole point of the tariffs, as I was talking about off the top. So that could be good for them. Again, it depends. There's a reason why people in the US were looking internationally, because the selection is bigger, because they often got a good deal with the exchange rate. So it depends. It may end up being a wash, but it does mean good things for a lot of US vintage sellers, and I don't want to overlook that. Hi, Vintage Jewelry Girl. Appreciate the combo on this. Thanks for being here. If anybody has any that they want to add, any impacts that they foresee happening, feel free to drop them in the comments. The other thing, though, for vintage dealers in the US is it can create less sourcing variety, right? So if anybody was sourcing internationally, a lot of people go to Europe to source antiques or vintage. It can impact them, right? Like, it's going to cost more to get all that stuff now, whether they are shipping it from those places or ordering it, and you know, they were able to get it in under that $800 before, then that makes a difference too. So that can also have a trickle-down effect to what's available for the US buyer, right? So if you have a shop that specializes in European antiques and they're an American shop and they often got all their antiques from Europe, and now it's costing way more for them to do that, they're not getting as good of stuff maybe, or they're having less inventory, and then there's less to choose from as the buyer as well. SK Finds, I just find it strange because Stallion states if you make an item and you don't have an manufacturing address, you can use your business address as the manufacturing address. Yeah, do it. If that's what they're saying. Do what the shipper's saying. Still don't understand why vintage sellers and clothing centers, but it can't do the same. But we'll have to see. I mean, you could use your business address and then just argue that you got that information from them. So, you know, I don't think that it's. You can put any address in there. Like, it'll take any address. It's just a matter of whether or not they're checking it. But it doesn't seem that the shippers are really checking it, because they're allowing people to put in whatever address and then it gets through. So, yeah, I think, again, try it, see what happens. I think at this point, the worst you could do is plead ignorance, because nobody knows what the hell is going on, to be honest. Yeah. Okay, and the other thing is, in Canada, because we still have those retaliatory tariffs in place, they are affecting Canadian dealers as well, who are trying to source from the US for the same reason. So people who are here who are bring in vintage and antiques, it's also affecting them, because if it was, you know, under the de minimis here too, which our de minimis is smaller, it is like $200. If it was under that, then they were able to get that stuff in without having to pay extra costs, right? So it does have a ripple effect, because those tariffs are in place because the US ones are in place, right? So it affects people on all kinds of levels. Yes, okay. What else do I have here? Oh yes, and then of course the ripple effect, right? So we talked about the impact to the businesses themselves, but also to everybody connected to those businesses. So that's you know, shippers, restorers, estate sale companies, appraisers, thrift stores, people like me, you know, part of the industry as well. There are all these other people that rely on the buying and selling of vintage to be working the way that it did, right? And they're going to feel the slowdown if sellers are not going to the thrift store to source as much, or not going to an estate sale to thrift or to find inventory as much, or whatever the case may be. It does have ripple effects on everybody else as well. So it's so silly to me. Imagine spot checking a Y2K top from the 90s that's worth $14.99. It seems like they have too much time on their hands. Yes, I don't actually know how much they're going to spot check now, and I think we were chatting about that in a DM earlier. But given the volume of stuff, I can't see spot checking being as rigorous as it was during the let's really target the made in China items, which they were doing before. For anybody not familiar, like, entire trucks were being turned around before if there was one wrong piece of information. I don't know how much of that is going to continue happening. The volume is such that I don't think that they can handle it, really. But the other thing is that the I lost my train of thought now. I just started like on this tangent in my mind. I'll come back to it if I think of it. Yes, I think the trucks being turned around. Yeah, I don't know where it went. We'll figure it out. Okay, so tips for buying and selling if you do want to sell, buy vintage at this time, and if you do decide to continue selling to the U.S. So we'll talk about the buying stuff first, and then I'll get kind of into the vendor segment, and then we'll wrap up. So if anybody's just joined us, we're just chatting a little bit about the impacts and the sort of state of affairs of things right now, where things have been at. Hello, Whitney, nice to see you. And now I am going to talk a little bit about buying vintage during this time. So if you have tips, if you have for a seller and you have tips for buyers and things that you want them to know right now, then drop it in the comments too, and we'll read them out and make sure it gets on the recording of this. But I said earlier about supporting people. Right now, I think one of the big things, and this space, I think buyers are already really accustomed to doing this, but thinking about who you want to support with your money, right? So local shops, that might be local shops, and local being in your region, in your state, in your province, in your country, whatever. Not just the bricks and mortar stores, which need the traffic, but of course your e-commerce stores too. So I don't want to overlook that, right? These people who are cross-border selling into the U.S. or who were a U.S. seller who was dealing in cross-border sourcing, for example, getting their inventory from other countries, this has affected them too. So finding out who is in your region, in your country, in terms of an online seller is a helpful thing to do too. On most platforms, you can filter by domestic shops if that's something that's important to you. If you do want to shop domestically, you can actually find out who is a shop in your region. If you want to support international businesses during this very difficult time, then that's great news too, of course. There are still plenty shipping to the U.S., so I want to highlight that. I know we've talked about people who have paused to the U.S., but there are still plenty. There's some who are in the comments here who are still shipping to the U.S., and that's great news. So everybody has their own priorities in terms of what they're going to do. But I think getting familiar with some of what we talked about today, so in terms of what sending via Canada Post or USPS or mail carrier means versus what sending via FedEx or UPS means. So you can see that information on a listing. It'll tell you, there you go, Vintage Jewelry Girl, we are shipping to the US. Can you tell us if you are doing delivery duty paid or unpaid? Finding out what those things mean, right? If you look on a listing, it'll say shipping via FedEx Ground or shipped via Canada Post /USPS. Etsy has that information. eBay has that information. You have that information at your disposal when you're purchasing an item. So as soon as you see that it's coming via Canada Post or USPS, then you know as the buyer that right now you don't actually owe anything on that. That those tariffs and duties are being prepaid for you by the vendor right now, right? So that is helpful to know. Like, there are certain things that are not going to cost you any more money as a US buyer right now if they are coming via postal shipments because of the way that they are collecting the tariffs and duties on that right now. Again, that may change in the future. But yeah, like Vintage Jewelry Girl is saying, paying any duties on our end. So really that means that as a buyer, that if you are buying a necklace for $50 or whatever, then it's $50. And like there's no change. So I think it's important to know that because it's not a big blanket thing that's happened. There are all kinds of things going on in which, pricing hasn't changed for the buyer anyway. And it's helpful, again, to look at how something is being shipped. So yes, Hollywood Weddings, please tell us what's working for you. Al, the vintage shop, I sent out 2 packages today via FedEx DDU. Okay, great. So those packages will show up to the customer on the other end, and then they'll get that invoice for it. I just ordered something from the States on eBay the other day, and I know I'm going to get that little bill at my door. It is something, if there's an item that you are really seeking and trying to find, it's paying the duties. It hurts a little bit, but it's worth it if you can't find it anywhere else, right? So it's good to know, again, that buyer, knowing that that's coming via FedEx, and they'll know that they're going to have that invoice. Buyer chose to continue and pay on delivery. Great. So this vintage shop owner, I'm assuming, talked to the buyer to find that out. I think that's a great thing to do, just to double check that they know what's coming, so that they know that they can, that they are meant to pay that when it comes to the door. SK finds, I worry that they will refuse the item and send it back to me. Yes, I want to talk about that. So people may have heard that you can do that. Obviously, something can show up at your door and FedEx can tell you that you have this bill for it as a buyer, and as the buyer, you are technically able to refuse the item, right? If you refuse the item, you don't get a refund, you don't get the item, and you may have to pay return shipping. It's probable that the seller will have to pay return shipping, but that's the case. But I think what I want to get across is that refusing an item creates a major cost for the seller. They have to usually pay to get that item back, or they forfeit the item and then the item gets disposed. So they can't resell it necessarily. They can't refund you. There's really no way out of that, right? So to avoid doing that, that's why we want to make sure that we know how an item is being shipped, right? So if you do not want a bill at your door, if that is not something that you're okay with, then only buying items where that is coming to you delivery duty paid, and you can get that right now through the postal system, the Canada Post or the USPS. And you can ask the seller ahead of time. They would way rather you ask than have you refuse the item at the door. So it's kind of a new way to shop, I guess. It's a new way to examine the information on a listing and make sure that you actually know what's going on. A lot of sellers are starting to include more information in their listings and telling you, this is going to have tariffs. I want you to know this ahead of time. They do want to be transparent with you because they want you to get that item and be excited about it and be understanding of the costs that are involved, if there are costs. Because again, like I said before, there are some cases where they're going to prepay it for you and then there aren't the costs. So, Tina, prices should change for U.S. buyers as that's what tariffs are meant to do. Yes. Yes, it is what they are meant to do. In every other case, we, as the buyer, pay duties. And if there were tariffs, then the tariffs too. Anytime I order from the US, or, I've ordered the odd thing from the UK, even Australia, I've ordered the odd thing from, that item comes to my door and then I have to pay as the buyer. That is just how it works usually with this stuff. And this has been a very unique situation in that there have been sort of rules in place that those duties must be collected ahead of time. And I think part of that is because of the volume of stuff going in, they knew that they were never going to be able to facilitate all that themselves. So they've instituted this where it's okay, you have to pay the duty. And again, like I said earlier, right now we're in a situation where the vendor is having to cover that cost, front that cost, but there will be solutions that come up that collect those duties from the buyer at checkout. We will see that happening eventually. So the buyer will ultimately pay, I think, in a lot of those cases. SK Finance, I know Net Parcel said if the buyer sends the item back, you are responsible for paying all duties. That sucks. Yeah. So I'm sorry to hear that. It depends on what shipper it is. That may happen, that the seller is responsible for paying all duties. So again, as a buyer, it's just a good citizen, just trying to find out what you're going to have to pay so that you know. And then, you don't have to order it if you don't want to pay it. And that's kind of the thing, right? People would rather know ahead of time. Al, I check in with each sale. I cancel if they choose, no problem. That's great. Yes, exactly. So it's good as a seller to check in. I know it's extra work, but just that extra thing, because right now it's a learning period, right? People don't necessarily, they're not necessarily familiar with this, right? Unless they happen to be on All My Lives and know what's going on. It's unlikely. But lots of people don't know what's going on. And so there is going to be a period where buyers are going to figure this out really quickly. And I think it's helpful as a seller to help give them that extra information right now and be transparent. Even though, yes, ultimately with delivery duty paid, unpaid, I should say, it is the buyer's responsibility. Just sort of guiding them and helping them make a good decision right now is a good thing to do for yourself as well, not just for them. If you're just joining us, we're talking a little bit about buying tips for this vintage era, this new era that we're in. And if you have any, I'd love to hear. If you're a seller and you have something that you want buyers to know, then tell them here. Another thing that's come up a bunch of times, and I just want to make sure we cover it here, is that in-person is different. Okay, so if you are flying to the UK or France or wherever, you still have an accompanied baggage exemption of US $800. So that is different than shipping items worth US $800. So if you have it on your person, in your luggage, then you still get that exemption. That still exists, right? That's a different $800, just happened to be the same amount, which is confusing. The other thing to know as a buyer is that split shipments aren't allowed. So if you wanted to get multiple things to try and like avoid high tariffs, I don't know that would apply anymore now that de minimis is over. I had that as a note. I don't know why. Before, basically, people were trying to avoid paying over $800 and asking the seller to put it into multiple packages, or the seller was doing that. But they actually have technology at the border that can check if some things are going to the same address over and over again. So I don't know that would be the case now that we're in this era that everything is getting tariffs and duties. I don't know why I wrote that. I was probably just zoned out. But regardless, multiple shipments to the same address, they are checking for that kind of stuff. So if something is fishy, they may be spot checking a little bit more. So again, if you missed it at the top, antiques and artwork, some of that stuff is exempt from the duties. And then some informational materials and artwork is exempt from the tariffs and duties. Okay. Tina, on Etsy, we can make a variation where the buyer has to choose an option. I'm in the US and no, I have to pay a tariff. I'm not in the US when Etsy makes the option available. So that's not available right now though, right? I just want to clarify the way that it's written. That would be really nice if it's like a consent of sorts. I don't know that that's available now, but it would be great. SK Finds, Thrift, usually I send a ton of bundles to clients. It'll be interesting to see the tariff rates for those orders. Yeah. So that's actually one thing to note. If they're going via mail shipments, they are tariffing the highest tariff item in that. So the whole package will just get, if you have a made in Canada item in there and then 2 made in UK items, then the whole parcel is getting the 35%. So CBP clarified that. That's for mail shipments only. And then the other way that they do it is they base it on the materials of the items and how you declare country of origin. And then now that you can itemize where the country of origin is on everything, then everything should be getting its own individual tariff rate. But there are some scenarios where they like look at the materials of how something is made up. I don't know that they're looking as closely at materials now that we're in this like whole crazy time that we are in. That's how they used to do it before the now times. They used to look at the material makeup. Tina, no, not available now as they don't collect. Making a variation in general to us available. Yes, that would be great if they do that. Okay. Yeah, I think we'll get kind of a little bit into the selling stuff. We've gotten a little bit into it already, but for any consumers who are on the call, thank you so much for coming by. I'll talk a little bit about selling stuff right now. I'm going to talk a little bit about navigating this new era as a seller and some of what I've been hearing sellers are doing right now, and I'd love for you to share with each other in the chat about what you are up to. So I mentioned earlier labeling country of origin. I think everybody knows that by now. On all products is kind of the best practice. There are marking rules for items over 20 years old that you only have to put it on the outside of the package, not on the individual items themselves. But there are some shippers, like in Canada, Chit Chats and Stallion are literally like requiring every product to be marked. So do with that what you will, but country of origin is supposed to be on all products. Obviously including the HTS codes. We talked a little bit earlier about manufacturer information and how some shippers are asking for it. Manufacturer information is supposed to be the address of the manufacturer. Obviously sometimes you don't know that, or the manufacturer has gone out of business. Some people are trying to use any address and it's accepting them that. If you want to do that, that's up to you. I can only tell you what I know, and I chatted about that a little bit earlier in terms of the fact that they do sometimes check this stuff. If you can't determine origin, the best practice is to just say it's made in China, because most likely it was, if you don't have anything else to go on. So it'll help to kind of avoid misdeclarations, even though the China tariff is quite high. If you have no, indication that it might have been made in Canada or Europe or wherever, then China is probably your best bet. But yes, they are checking. We'll see how often they're checking now, but they are. I want you to, if you have shipping questions, if you're a seller, feel free to chat to each other about that. Some of what I have been hearing sellers do, we talked about pausing shipping. We know some people are doing that. Adding a flat handling fee, I talked about that right at the top. People are using that as an option especially if they have like flat rate shipping. It's a little bit more of a easier option. Adding a flat handling fee to say, hey, this is $20 and it's covering tariffs. I'm seeing that a lot on like if people sell on social media, especially, maybe not so much on Etsy, because like Tina mentioned earlier, you have to apply it to everybody on Etsy, and it's not like you can differentiate. So depending on how people are selling, there may be, if you're buying something direct on Instagram, there may be like a $20 fee or something like that to help pay for the tariffs. Buy now, shop 59. Hi. If selling via a live show, educate the buyers as much as possible and keep the lines of communication open after the sale. I love that. Thank you for adding that. I totally agree. And I was just saying, I think even though it's the buyer's responsibility to know about all this stuff, I think it's important to provide that communication, and it's helping yourself, right? Like it's helping you with potentially not having a returned order or whatever. It's creating some trust as well with the customer. They feel like they can turn to you for that kind of reliable information. I think that's helpful. And, the more transparent you can be, the better. You are transparent as a small business owner in a way that a big company never really could be. So I think that that's also appreciated by people. SK fines. In your opinion, do you think they would be random checking or checking larger orders coming in, like businesses who deal with high volumes and higher priced items? Just curious. Yeah, I think they are probably checking stuff that is going to the same address. So I know a lot of people on Amazon are kind of like doing drop shipping / fulfillment type of things, and they're sending stuff to the same place all the time. They're probably checking that stuff a lot, because that is how the fentanyl was getting in a lot of places, I guess, those kinds of orders, I guess. I don't know that they'll be checking random stuff, especially because a lot of people in this space are selling to individuals, right? So you were sending this to somebody's home. You're not necessarily sending it to like a business. And yes, when the item value is like $50, I don't know that they're gonna do it. But I don't know, right? Like I'm not in the customs agency. I can only speculate. I don't know what they're doing. So, and that's kind of the problem, right? It's how much risk do you want to take as a business owner in terms of what you're willing to bear, right? Like you might go ahead and assume that they're never going to spot check, and then they never do, and then that's great. And then you might assume they're going to spot check, and then they do, and something happens. I don't know how hardcore they're going to be about finding people. I haven't done enough research on that to know, like, in terms of the last 6-8 months, what has happened in terms of like finding people. That would be something interesting to look into that I probably won't have time to do. But yeah, it's just how much risk do you want to take yourself? And, I think this space is very under the radar in terms of the executive order, in terms of the legislation of CUSMA. So there's no reason to believe that it wouldn't be more under the radar here too. Let us know if you hear of anything. Yes, I've heard of all kinds of things lately. I heard, I won't even repeat some of the stuff that I heard because I don't want to like spread rumors. I heard a lot of stuff that I don't think is true. So yeah, I'll let you know if I hear of anything concrete. That's for sure. Okay. We have seen, yes, other people are using express carriers. So some of the people on the call are turning to FedEx or UPS, and that's working for some people as well. I mentioned it earlier if you just joined us recently, but some of the platforms that are facilitating some of this has been a little bit of a horror show the last few days, I think. The incorrect calculations. There has been some really great stories about using the Zonos app. I understand they're using like an AI recognition software to look at items and help you determine the HS code and stuff on them, and it's not working for other people. So I understand they are continually updating that. So just check in your app store all the time if there's an update, if it hasn't auto updated for you. That may help. They're still all kind of figuring this out, right? Like Chit Chats and Stallion in Canada only just launched their DDP solutions last Wednesday, so it's been 1 week only. Check and see what's happening. Reaching out to the shipper directly, I think, is really important. A lot of you have done that already, and I think that's great. And go with what they say, right? Like, and every shipper is going to be different. Net Parcel might say something different than Chit Chats. I might say something different than Stallion, right? And just kind of use what they say. I said earlier, I've tried USA origin items on Chit Chats, and it's getting like a tariff and duty rate, even though their site says that US items are duty free. So there's a lot of discrepancy right now, which is unfortunate. It's unfortunate. Checking other shipping agents, so Net Parcel came up a couple of times, but there's also ClickShip, EasyShip, ShipTime, these kind of like amalgamators that will give you rates from Purelator and Canpar and DHL and UPS and FedEx, all those shippers. So there may be other options. There may be cheaper options. In some cases, the Canada Post, I know, always felt like the most expensive. In some cases, it still might be the best option, even against like a Chit Chats or Stallion, especially if you're able to use that without the manufacturer information and having to go through that whole rigmarole. So I think when we're talking about being transparent with customers and educating customers, another conversation that we can all be having more is just about the cost of shipping in general. And these low-cost carriers exist, and it's been helpful for vintage and antiques and secondhand sellers to use them because it makes, shopping a little bit more attractive when you can offer a slightly lower rate via a Chit Chats or a Canada Post, for example. But somebody told me this, and I wish I knew who it was now. It might have been Labelli Vintages. I don't remember, so I don't want to. Anyways, if you're on the call, say in the comments if it was you. But a vintage seller is not an Amazon seller. So, and you are not an Amazon either. So talking to customers about why shipping costs what it costs. If you are looking at DDU options like a FedEx for reasons beyond, I'm worried that the customer is gonna reject it. If you are looking at those options, you could frame it more as like, this is I don't want to say a safer option, but it's like it's a very trustworthy option, right? Like a FedEx is going to get you your item very quickly. You're going to be, insured for this. Like it's going to be, it enters the US in a different manner than like your Chit Chats and your Stallion. There is a reason why it is more expensive, is what I'm trying to say. And shipping costs a lot because fuel costs a lot, and because shipping shouldn't be free, right? Like shipping should not be free. There are people that are involved in the shipping process that need to be paid, that are in warehouses who need to be paid, so the fact that vintage and antique sellers have had to compete with the Amazons of the world that offer this free shipping, that you have to offer free shipping even sometimes on Etsy to even make your products more attractive. It's really unfortunate that we have entered this post-consumerist era that we all want things for the cheapest possible rate. So talking to customers, telling them why shipping is more expensive. Hey, I'm going to start shipping via FedEx or Canada Post if you were using Chit Chats before. And shipping is going to go up by this much, and this is why, because it allows me to clear my items without having to know manufacturer information, just being transparent with people and letting them know, like, this is why. And I think a lot of the time we make assumptions about what people are willing to spend, right? Because we base them on what we're willing to spend, right? We base those thoughts on what we think that a customer would pay, or what we would pay, right? And so we're like, okay, well, a customer is not going to pay this extra amount of shipping because, I wouldn't pay that. But there are people out there who would. And the U.S. is a 340 million strong market, and there are a lot of people in the U.S. And, giving them that option of FedEx, it may end up working for you. Like it might, and they might be willing to pay if you're like Al's Vintage Shop earlier, who double checks ahead of time and says, hey, you are going to get a bill for this at the end, and just having that extra conversation, I think, is important, right? Can't always expect everything for free, and I know a lot of consumers don't necessarily get that or agree with that, but it's true, and there's a reason why shipping is expensive. That's what I'm trying to say. I feel like I was on a real tangent there, but so yeah, studying what might be a viable option for you, I think, is a really good thing. That might include the delivery duty unpaid. Yes, I don't think many of my customers will pay $75 US for a $35. Yes, that's a good point, Dina. There are going to be items that are just, they're non-competitive when you introduce that kind of shipping cost, especially because you're sending from overseas, and that's going to be more expensive than somebody shipping from Canada. So yes, a $35 item, it's not going to make the most sense, right? But if you have an item that's worth $100, that buyer may have already made that kind of decision in their mind to spend that amount, right? And they might be willing to pay more for shipping to get that item. If you have an item that's worth $200, $300, $400. So it always depends on what that inventory is. But I agree with you. A $35 item with that kind of shipping rate, it's not going to be viable. But looking into it, I think, is important. Getting very clear on what is required of you once you choose a shipper, and then just sticking to that shipper, like I said, like letting them tell you what to do, and then just pleading ignorance if anything comes up. Just be like, my shipper told me this, right? So just really understanding what is required of you from that shipper, and that can be hard because we're all here comparing Stallion, Chit Chats, blah blah, FedEx. Choosing that shipper and then abiding by their rules, I think, is a good way to go. Listings information. So we had somebody talk about how they reached out to customers, but as much information as possible. Yes, customers don't read, but that doesn't mean the info shouldn't be there. So whenever you can, and I know that is a huge job for some people because there's so many listings, but I think I think it was was it Buy Sell who said that earlier? Buy Now Shop 59 was saying transparency and communication really helps right now. So the more information that you can share, the better, letting them know what to expect, how your items are shipped. All my items are shipped by Canada Post, blah, blah, blah. Even though it says that on your shipping or who the carrier is. Having that information again at the top of the listing could help. It could catch somebody's eye there, so that helps. Looking at domestic opportunities, so a lot of people are using this opportunity. I don't want to call it opportunity. A lot of people are using this moment in time to look at new revenue opportunities, right? So not just in person, because that is like a common go-to, what can I do locally in my local market? And that's a good thing to look at, but on your platforms too, right? If you are engaged in cross-border trade, then you are an online seller, and how can you optimize and get noticed by that platform and maybe get featured more in their regional searching, for instance? What can you do to your listings to make them show up in the Etsy picks or the the things that they feature? So really digging into their seller tools, their materials, in terms of what you can do right now to maximize the opportunity you do have in your regional and domestic market, I think, is a good thing to try. One seller told me they are picking differently now. So because of this whole manufacturer information thing, if they can't see the manufacturer information, or they don't have country of origin that's obvious, I should say. The country of origin, I think, is what they were talking about. Then it either goes into their local booth or they skip it altogether. Like if they're trying to ship it to the US, then they want to make sure that they know where that's coming from, because they've got to tell the US where it's coming from. So sourcing differently can also be something you can make better decisions going forward. Opening up to other markets. So I know for Canadian sellers selling into the EU, and I would imagine anybody outside of the EU, selling into the EU is kind of challenging right now. They have some specific safety regulations that require a authorized representative to kind of vouch for your items when you're shipping into that space. But looking into it and seeing what you can do if you don't have selling open to the EU, selling to the UK. I've seen sellers, they're opening up to Australia, Japan, all kinds of other places. If you're not already international that way, then that could be another way to improve, or I shouldn't say improve, but replace some lost sales. Diversifying revenue as well. So non-product experiences, if you have anything at all that you can do in terms of workshops, styling, decluttering, all that kind of stuff. Those are the service things that could garner you some extra income in your local market as well. And depending on your inventory, I don't know that anybody on the call will be in this situation, but depending on your inventory, if you have a lot of it, there could be other fulfillment or warehousing opportunities in the US. So thinking about what they call 3PL, so that's third-party logistics, finding somebody to actually store your stuff in the US and then delivering it right out of there can also be an option. Again, it depends on what you sell, but I know some people who are in the higher-end jewelry space who are looking into stuff like that. Somebody that I know, deals in a lot of prints, so that might be something that they want to do. They have a huge inventory. If their market is big enough in the US, then they could open up sort of a fulfillment service, right? And store that inventory in the US. So that's another option. Yeah, and I think just connecting with customers, continuing to build that bond, letting people know, and I say this, I feel like in every single life that I have, but letting people know more about you and your business and who you are as a small business owner, and how this has impacted you, everything. Just creating that connection for people and reminding them why buying locally, whether it's local in person or locally on their online or internationally, letting them know why, who you are, and creating that sort of relationship. Those can be strong things, and people can still want to support you even in more difficult times. So yeah, I think that's kind of what I wanted to cover in terms of today. Does anybody have any other questions or comments that they want to make before I kind of wrap up here? Let me know in the comments. I think this was a really good conversation. I just talked for 90 minutes straight, so I'm sort of realizing that. Thanks if you're still here from the beginning, thanks for hanging out and joining me tonight and sharing your experiences. I really appreciate the comments that you've had in the main space here, and I'm sure that we will see this situation evolve over the coming weeks, coming days even. And you can always check out what's happening at the Vintage Seeker. I am updating my tariffs articles still fairly regularly. The website has events, resources, memberships. There's the Shop Secondhand Directory, all at the link in my bio. There's also a link at my bio to support my work there too. If your memberships aren't your thing, then there's a donation button on the memberships page, so you can support the work there. Thank you so much for hanging out with all of us. Thank you, Hollywood Weddings. I appreciate that. And yes, if you are watching the replay, would still love to hear from you in the comments. You can drop that in the comments underneath this video. And until next time, I will see you then. So thanks again. Thanks for the engagement. Thanks for chatting and letting me know what's up. I appreciate it. Okay, see ya.